Hello and welcome to today's discussion, a closer look into Cosmic, Singapore's new digital data sharing platform. My name is Bradley Maclean and I'm co-founder of Regulation Asia. In October, the MAS in Singapore issued a consultation paper introducing a new regulatory framework to provide banks the ability to share information to prevent money laundering and proliferation financing. The platform, called Cosmic, the collaborative sharing of money laundering and terrorism financing information and cases, is underpinned by new legislative changes to collectively enable 6 banks at the moment to request and provide customer information in a secure manner when certain risk thresholds have been triggered. And this is what brings us here today, to delve into the developments with 2 of the key stakeholders that have been directly actively involved in Cosmic's development. Today, I'm sitting down with Jamil Ahmed, Chief Compliance Officer at HSBC Singapore. Welcome, Jamil.
Thank you, Bradley. Great to be here.
And Chee Kin Lam, Managing Director, Secretariat, and Head of Legal Compliance at DBS Bank. Welcome, Chee Kin.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks for having me here. Very excited.
That's fine. Stumbling on a couple of words to kick off the morning, but there we go. But today, the goal is to really deep dive into how Cosmic will work. It's the expectations of how it will address and combat financial crime, and how, I guess more importantly, progress is being made given the launch of the platform is in the coming year. So, Chee Kin, I guess as a starting point, I guess the big question for me is, what is the platform being developed and why now? Are there any unique considerations for the platform, given Singapore's unique position in the global financial region?
Yeah, thanks, Brad. I think there is a universal problem that affects all banks, whether you're in Singapore or otherwise. And that basically is this, that banks typically act within the sphere of the information that that bank has or has access to. And typically that bank acts, analyzes, and exits customers or takes decisions based on that information. I think what criminals are doing is they are exploiting that difference between what one bank knows and another bank knows. So let's say one bank has arrived at the conclusion that the customer is suspicious and takes action against that customer. Well, what happens is that customer then moves to another bank and does exactly the same thing with the other bank, but that bank does not have the benefit of what the upstream bank has. So this platform is designed to try to address the information asymmetry problem to prevent the customers from exploiting, or rather illegitimate actors from exploiting that asymmetry, right? So the way it works then is to allow concerns to be flagged between banks. And then if those concerns reach a material level, it allows banks to alert each other. And then actually, if there is evidence of significant or material risk activity, then actually the system will come in and alert the authorities for the authorities to take further action, because actually there is an impactful case that's developing. I hope that 30 seconds helps to contextualize exactly what this is we're dealing with.
No, that makes sense. And apologies if this is a silly question, but you've used the term platform, and we have in the introduction as well. What is the difference between this platform and, I guess, other utilities or large transactional databases?
Yeah. So in Singapore, we learned a lot from a previous project that we were working on, which was intended to build a KYC utility for the corporate segment in Singapore. And then what happens is this: it is risky to build a massive customer database that consolidates information across multiple banks. And it is also risky to build a massive transaction database to handle, process, and analyze all that data. Your cybersecurity risk increases considerably. It is very difficult to harmonize operational standards across multiple banks. So lifting operational processes from one bank and putting it into a central area, but trying to do that across multiple banks, it's very, very difficult to harmonize and then very expensive. It is also very difficult to harmonize risk appetite across multiple banks. So I think for all these reasons, a decision was taken not to create one big central database, one big transactional database, but to actually zero in on exactly what the risk is or what the problem is we're trying to solve, and move away from just a KYC type of problem to how do we stop the criminals from exploiting that asymmetry.
I mean, Jamil, you're in a unique position. Obviously, you're with a global bank, but you're heading up a very particular area. I mean, when looking at the platform, are there any unique considerations for Singapore in comparison to other frameworks such as the US?
So I think the benefit that we have with HSBC is that we're involved in multiple public-private partnerships across the world. And therefore, we do have the ability to actually level set and identify those areas that are going to present some positives and some major step forwards in terms of how we deal with financial crime in certain parts of the world. So we are obviously, through that intelligence and through our participation, aware that there are many different aspects in different jurisdictions which do permit information sharing. However, I think what the unique factor about COSMIC is that other jurisdictions may have the regulatory permissions for banks to share information, such as in the US, there's provisions in the Patriot Act, which do enable banks, upon the notification to the various regulatory authorities, to share information. COSMIC's uniqueness is that it's, first of all, it's mandatory. There's no optionality there to provide information when certain risk factors have been triggered. And the second thing is the ability for this to be systemic and scaled across the participating banks and to be fundamental part of their risk management and investigative processes. And I think that uniqueness is something that sets COSMIC apart from the various initiatives that we are experiencing or seeing in HSBC.
So I like the issue on data sharing, and I'd like to put a pin on that for the moment, and we'll come back to it. I mean, Chee Kin, originally, as I understand, the focuses will be around 3 distinct areas, trade-based money laundering, shell companies, and proliferation financing. I guess, as a starting point, why these particular areas, and how do you expect this I guess, scope to expand over time?
Yeah, Ken. So I think, again, following, reflection and lessons learned, it always makes sense to prioritize, be risk-based, and target the most impactful or significant areas. Almost every typology, right? Even if you go after things like, wildlife trafficking or human trafficking, even if you go after that, they need a shell company network to layer the proceeds and to kind of insulate them from detection. And that is basically the shell company typology, which is first and foremost, I guess, one of the primary objectives of COSMIC. We're going to target professional laundering networks using shell companies, right? Secondly, it's unquestionable that sanctions risk is considerable. It's impactful. It only exacerbates with geopolitical tension. So that's number 2. And then I guess, given Asia, its position, Singapore, its position in trade corridors and trade networks, trade-based money laundering makes a lot of sense to target. Yeah. So it's not to say that we're not going to go after all types of crime. It's just that actually, if you do target shell companies, you actually by proxy target multiple different types of crime already. And then sanctions and trade-based is probably a function of the time that we're living in and the place that we're living in.
I mean, but how do you expect, I understand the current focus, but where do you expect it to expand over time? Are you expecting it's going to be more around payment service providers, crypto, or other areas?
Yeah. So I think it'll move by risks. Now, one logical way to expand is something that Jamil said already, right? Which is to bring more banks into the fold. We actually cover a lot of the market already with the current 6 banks that are involved, but the one logical expansion is to add more banks. The other logical expansion is to add more risks, right? So like I said, I alluded to human trafficking, wildlife trafficking. You could actually target other types of material areas. For example, corruption could be one of those areas to target. So I think we'll proceed along scaling by adding more people or adding more risks to the scope.
So in preparation for today's discussion, Jamil, I mean, I actually read an article you wrote about COSMIC and fraud, which obviously is not those original 3 kind of categories. I mean, where do you see the crossover into fraud?
Yeah, so look, I think it touches upon a point that Chee Kin had made. There's going to be certain indicators that are indicative of financial crime that are going to apply to multiple different risk types. And one of the sorts of key components I saw from a fraud perspective was similar to what we have with shell companies. We do see criminal networks requiring the use of mule accounts to remit funds from the source destination to, or the source of the crime itself, right through to where the ultimate beneficiaries are, if you like, you can call them beneficiaries. But through the watch list, that's another key feature of COSMIC, which will basically be a list that will be provided to banks that indicates that these individuals or entities have been engaged in some form of potential financial crime and therefore have been subject to investigations, STR filings, etc. The availability of that list will prevent or will enable banks to prevent onboarding of customers, whether they're mule accounts or whether they're shell companies, to halt that continuation of getting access to financial services within a particular financial system like Singapore. So that's where I see the benefit and crossover. I just want to sort of also supplement in terms of the scalability piece that Chee Kin had actually mentioned. You know, we have invested quite a lot of time as industry participants in defining the framework, the parameters, the types of red flags, and it's been a lot easier for us to align as an industry on what those red flags are compared to what Chee Kin was mentioning in terms of utilities and aligning standards, etc. Therefore, given that we've got a very good baseline in terms of what those red flags are, once the platform is up and running, there'll be a state of maturity that will obviously, require. But once that happens, I think the scalability and the ease of which we're able to extend onto other risk factors will be a lot easier and a lot quicker. So I do think this will be a natural and intuitive evolution, and I don't see the necessary input that's required to actually get to that level, compared to what we've been doing with Cosmic to try and get it off the ground.
So you'd mentioned, red flags and watch lists. I mean, fundamentally, how is the platform designed to work? Will you be reporting everything where you suspect that there's a bad actor, or is there some kind of quality control around that, Jamil?
Yeah, sure. There's different components of Cosmic. There's some optionality of Cosmic, which is really the request, and that is the ability for banks to request information and for risks or for red flags that may not necessarily have been triggered per the Cosmic framework. So this is more an optionality component for banks. The second component is mandatory. So that's where a predefined set of triggers or a minimum threshold for those predefined red flags have been met and have been hit, and therefore it becomes mandatory. And this is before STR filing, so it's at the early stages of investigation. It becomes mandatory to provide that information to the Cosmic platform, right? So that's where you're providing that information to banks who also have a nexus to that particular customer, and that in itself will be used as a trigger to identify, well, is there sort of similar risks that are being observed in other banks that may not necessarily have been triggered through existing transaction monitoring processes? And it's that mandatory component of information, I think, that becomes really critical, because it does mean that bank processes and controls have to be fundamentally adapted to ensure that we're meeting that mandatory requirement. And that is a regulatory requirement. It's enforceable, obviously, from a supervisory perspective, and therefore should become part and parcel of how we actually conduct investigations. And I think, just to kind of draw upon one of the major benefits that we see here as well, I mean, Chee Kin kind of gave a very good insight into this in his opening remarks, but we file as an industry to the local law enforcement authorities around 30 to 35,000 STRs a year. And what this common pooling and trigger of information will do will enable better quality STRs to be filed to law enforcement, so they're not necessarily having to piece it all together. I mean, I know there's limitations of resource at law enforcement, as it is with banks, but having that commonality and through the framework in terms of common customers, identifying nexuses, and agreeing what those common risk factors are, I think will just enable more comprehensive and holistic investigations to take place, and therefore more robust and comprehensive STRs to be filed to help law enforcement with their ongoing investigation activities. So just one angle I want to sort of comment on, which is, on the receipt of this information, what do we see as one of the benefits?
So Chee Kin, I'm quite keen to understand kind of the confidence on the data level. I mean, in terms of the sufficient standard of proof, is this defined by the regulator, or is this through consensus with the consortium with Cosmic?
Yeah. So I think we spend quite a bit of time here. And I think, if I were to distill an overriding theme for this, it is the correct balance between effectiveness and efficiency, right? So we know from subjects like suspicious transaction report reform that maybe we need to harvest a bit more efficiency. We do know from things like looking at data on false positives in transaction surveillance that we do need to try to target more effectiveness, right? So we're targeting risk types. We're coming up with this. because of effectiveness, and we've got to strike that balance with efficiency, right? So how do we avoid spamming the system with too much information at very low levels of confidence or low levels of probative value? How do we put into the system information that is material, impactful, actionable? I mean, that was what we were going for. So I guess as the banks met and talk through the design standards, it's a combination. It's probably a combination of some quantitative data, certain characteristics, certain rich red flags that we want to see, and qualitative data, the confidence level by which you have established that substance to be impactful or material, right? So we typically say this is probably just about the level where you're willing to exit the client, and that's when you should start putting it into the system at very high alert levels to the rest of the colleagues, or else at lower confidence levels, well, then just request and provide, but maybe the mandatory overlay doesn't apply so much. And so we did think through quite a lot of this, but the overriding consideration is what is the balance we want between effectiveness and efficiency.
Okay, so I quite like that, looking at the balance. I mean, from your perspective as a prominent local institution, I mean, what are your expectations around the platform? Chee Kin.
Yeah. Clearly, it's exactly going back to what I described earlier, right? I think history has shown us that many impactful cases, somebody upstream knew about the case and was taking action. So if you're a downstream bank, you're saying, yeah, why did I have to redo all the work? So I think the key benefit to this is primarily the ability to jump onto impactful cases much earlier on and taking advantage of information that you may not be privy to. A very, very simple example, right? So the deposit account may be in Bank A and the trade facility may be in Bank B. Bank A, in only looking at the deposit account, would never know if something is going wrong on the trade, but the problem converges at the client level. So if Bank B takes action, please tell Bank A, look, there's a potential issue with this customer. I think that's the whole point around this. Don't just be limited by the information which you are constrained to.
Jamil, I mean, same question. You're part of a very large global institution. Do you have the same expectations and objectives, or are they slightly different?
No, absolutely. I think we're fully aligned in terms of the expectations and the benefits. I mean, you know, if you go back in the last couple of years, there have been some high-profile cases in Singapore where multiple banks, both local institutions and international institutions, have unfortunately been exposed. And one of the kind of issues that we've all experienced is that, you know, there would have been many different triggers for reviewing that particular relationship amongst the various different banks that had exposure to that client or that you know, those entities. But there are limitations in terms of what was actually available. So it goes back to Chee Kin's point, you know, the availability of information to actually peer through into what's actually happening at the house bank or operating account level was just not there. And had that been there, then I'd like to think that the outcomes would have been very, very different and concerns identified a lot quicker and a lot sooner. So absolutely, we're fully aligned with those expectations. And we are fully aligned, obviously, with the benefits that this will bring for our client base.
So I just wanted to deep dive a little bit on the enforcement side. I mean, how does the platform actually interact with law enforcement? Is it changing those interactions in any way? And I guess more importantly, how do you expect it's going to drive more timely investigations and potentially leading to more effective prosecutions?
Yeah. So I think the quality of, you know, I talked just now about the probative value of the information. I think we do have an assumption, right? And when Cosmic is launched, we hope that this will manifest in practice, right? We do have an assumption that the quality of the information in the system is going to be much better, and the probative value of that information is going to be much better, right? The fact that Bank A, Bank B, Bank C may all be putting the information on the same case into the system also allows for much better triangulation of signals, and instead of sifting through 35,000 or, you know, hundreds of thousands of suspicious transaction reports, right? Maybe one more design aspect to this is that the data is structured. It's not just unstructured data. It's not just one paragraph on a Word document. It's actually structured fields, right? So actually what can happen in the age of analytics is to mine the structured data for commonalities, convergence, common attributes, correlations to other intelligence that only the public sector has, and hopefully from that gain another weapon that is hopefully benefiting the system and exiting criminals. And I'll maybe also describe a corollary here, right? Actually, if you're much, much better at identifying the criminals, you are similarly much, much better necessarily at preventing good guys, legitimate actors, from being caught up wrongly in a case, because your resolution of criminal activity, your probative sense is so much better.
So you're saying that essentially, because of the quality of the data, the analytical tools, you'll reduce the false positives, which means there should be less time wasted on kind of false leads. Is that correct?
Yes, and jumping faster onto an impactful case, right? Instead of having to do all the old work that we used to do.
No, it makes sense. I mean, I do like that point about essentially weaponizing data, and I'm assuming that's not what you meant, but it is another way where we can look at data. But then doesn't this raise some privacy concerns? I mean, Jamil, how do you see compliant data sharing working across the platform? And more importantly, how is this going to interact domestically, internationally, and are there any safeguards being put in place?
Look, it's a very relevant point. It's something that sort of, I think, is debated, was debated thoroughly in Singapore, but I know it's coming up as point of discussions in other public-private partnerships that are looking to kind of come up with a similar solution. And obviously, I think from this perspective, there's ultimately a trade-off that needs to take place, right? So, because I think without sharing the information across banks and able to do, the ability to do that at scale, then these kind of initiatives such as COSMIC, it'll be very difficult for them to really mature and take hold in certain markets. So the ultimate trade-off is, will clients be willing to kind of forgo some elements of data privacy for the greater good of society? And the greater good of society is very much obviously the ability to detect bad guys and criminal actors a lot quicker and better and protect financial systems. And I think that's the ultimate trade-off. And I think in various different markets in Singapore, that debate has to happen in terms of the benefits that COSMIC or similar initiatives such as COSMIC will bring versus some of the data privacy trade-offs. Now, having said that, platforms such as COSMIC can also be designed that give a high degree of confidence in terms of when that information will be shared, how it will be shared, and how it will be secured. And obviously this is on the back of, this is where I see the regulatory enforcement and supervision coming in, is to ensure that that data is actually being transmitted securely, safely, and is used appropriately, which are all common data privacy type outcomes or concerns. So that's how I'd see things happening. But ultimately, look, I think we need to sort of realize or recognize things for the way they are, that there is that ultimate trade-off that has to be considered.
I mean, I understand the trade-off, but is there an expectation that the data potentially will be used on a cross-border basis? And I guess more importantly, when you're looking at global institutions such as yourselves, how will it work across the group entities and subsidiaries? Sure.
So we have, I mean, if you look at banking processes within a global financial institution, our existing customer terms and conditions, providing they sort of, we don't have restrictions from a jurisdictional standpoint, they do allow information, particularly when it comes to financial crime concerns, to be shared cross-border. So, banks typically have a common data lake that jurisdictions that do have the ability to, or the relevant permissions to share information cross-border, that data will flow into that data lake. And also from a process and procedure standpoint, there is that existing ability for banks to share some concerns with other entities or other affiliates that may commonly bank that customer as trigger points for investigations. So that activity happens today. So we do have existing frameworks to enable that information to be shared cross-border where laws and regulations allow. And I see COSMIC being an add-on to that, because the COSMIC initiative does enable information to be shared cross-border with other sort of affiliates and with group offices. But there's obviously certain conditions that have to be met, which is really around how that data will be disclosed, and the parties to which that data will be disclosed to. And obviously the safeguards in place to ensure that that data, given it's not harvested by HSBC or through our own systems, the identity of that data or the remitting bank or the originating bank where that data came from, that's obviously got to be masked and not disclosed. So there are certain safeguards in place for that information to be used securely, safely, cross-border. But obviously the MAS and the industry recognize that there's utility and value in sharing some of this information cross-border, because we will have entities that may be multi-banked, we will have maybe larger groups of customers that will have common relationships. And when we're looking at a risk of a relationship, we typically want to look at the risk of the relationship as a whole rather than the individual entities. So therefore, there may be a need to sort of provide some of this information, some of the concerns to broader governance forums that are looking across different geographies.
So based on that, I mean, it sounds like from the development of the platform perspective, it's essentially old challenges, new tools. It's not necessarily having to reshape the legislative framework around privacy and data, because that was already existing, and it's looking to leverage these existing frameworks. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's largely the case. Yeah, from my perspective, Chee Kin, maybe you want to sort of lead from your point.
Yeah, probably 80-85% from where I stand, right? Maybe let me just run through a few points. Right, the first point is this is still in technical design, and I do think what Jamil said, I could not agree more. We have got to decide what is that balance between the rights of a customer, an individual, if that customer is a criminal, and the rights or the benefits to the system from, in a sense, having that information protecting the system. So what is this trade-off, and what is the way we want to strike that balance? That, I think, is the core question. And that translates into a data design issue. Jamil talked a little bit about masking certain data attributes and allowing certain data attributes to go through. Like, for example, customer, got a very high confidence level that customer is an illegitimate actor. Actually, it is in the interest of the system to get that information across. But there's an operational design aspect to it as well, right? So it's very logical that if DBS Singapore has possession of the information, it stands to reason that DBS London should also similarly have that information. And I think that's the part that is relatively easier to address from the legislative perspective. Where it gets a little bit more difficult is, can that information then be passed on to another participating bank? And that participating bank then transmitting that information to, in a sense, far-flung reaches of the organization. Jamil alluded to this already by indicating that, even within an international organization, you've got to decide who has access to information and in what context is going to be used. You don't want to be used then for, customer acquisition as well, right? So I think these things have to be defined, and it is worth parking a conversation here that, legislation will be, in a sense, probably appropriate to both unlock sharing where it's appropriate and to circumscribe sharing where it's inappropriate, right? So I think the legislation will come in to add criminal deterrence for misuse of the information, but also to unlock information sharing where there's ambiguity in today's law. And here I really shout out, because the public sector in Singapore has been very committed to that process of coming up with that legislation.
So the legislation at the moment is really around enabling the data sharing. Is that correct?
For a limited financial use case, for financial crime use case, and then for certain purposes like risk management purposes. But I don't think that legislation, which was kind of like updated in 1990, 2000, like that, right? I don't think it had contemplated COSMIC, right? So you do have to ask the question, what should COSMIC be backed by in terms of legislative authorization? So yeah, sorry, Jamil. I don't disagree. Actually, I think you've framed the question correctly, but I do want to dial up this sensitivity with the fact that we do need some legislative. You need legislative protection as well, right? What if a bank puts the information into the system and then gets sued by a customer for defamation, for example, right? So you do want these kinds of things to be thought through and decisions to be made about whether we want to protect or circumscribe and that kind of thing.
I mean, so that's an interesting kind of angle. I mean, how is the system designed to protect good actors from getting their information onto the system? And I guess more importantly, how will those users potentially be removed if they're found not to be bad actors?
Exactly right. Yeah, exactly right. And this is where I think it's quite important to again say we're in a design phase right now, right? So we are coming up with technical specifications, we're deciding what legislation we're going to be providing, and so on and so forth. Through this design phase, the questions that you've raised, absolutely correct. Good actors must not, in fact, there must be a process to allow good actors to in a sense, almost get a heads up on the concerns that a bank has before the bank just puts their information into the system. And we call this the appeal process. So before information is put at an alert level into the system, then actually by process, the banks are obliged to go back to the customer, confront the customer with the basis for the concern, and to obtain the customer's explanation for that. Now, bad actors, we all know, they obfuscate, they give you lousy documents, they don't reply to you, get angry at you, right? So if those characteristics manifest, then okay, good, we'll put the information into the system, right? But actually, if confronted with the information, the good actor comes back and supports it, corroborating information, independent testimony, then okay, then the information won't get into the system. This has to be regulated carefully, right? So I fully expect MAS to use their supervisory powers to make sure that all the participants are responsibly putting information into the system and not just arbitrarily misusing this. Very consistent with what Jamil said as well.
So Jamil, Chee Kin's just mentioned that we're in the design phase, right? So is this a technical build out at this stage? I mean, as I understand, there's going to be a pilot program that will run for the next 2 years. I mean, from your perspective, what are banks doing now to start getting ready for the launch of the platform?
So I think that there's a couple of things that are working through in sequence, in conjunction with each other, right? So in parallel. So the MAS is obviously looking to kind of build and tender and go through that process of constructing the central platform. At the same time, banks are actually working through what the technical specifications will be in terms of interacting and interfacing with that platform, right? So there is an element of trying to sort of consider and learn as things and more information kind of unfolds. I think from a bank perspective, obviously it's quite clear in order for us to try and meet these timelines, we've got to be running at pace and we've got to be doing things in parallel rather than waiting for one thing to happen and for them banks to actually take the baton and develop things internally themselves. So there's an element of unknown there, as Chee Kin mentioned, we're in that sort of design phase. But what we're doing, obviously, from a global bank perspective, is because many of our systems are used not just in Singapore but across different geographies. I mentioned a common data lake that information will flow into for jurisdictions that will enable it. And therefore, we have started the process to start to engage those teams, the system owners, to look at some of the specifications and amendments that do need to take place to those global systems. And also building in some of the safeguards that we touched upon, such as masking some of the information that may be flowing through from Cosmic into those data lakes. So that in itself is, raising some interesting questions. But certainly, the quicker we sort of get to those questions and the answers, the easier it'll be for us to meet the regulatory timeframe for this platform. So that's what's happening internally in the banking side at the moment.
You'd mentioned that you're doing this in parallel with everything being put together, I guess, from a technical specifications perspective. I mean, Jamil, where do you expect to see the most likely teething issues?
I would say it's really around where we're leveraging common platforms essentially within the bank and leveraging common systems is how we kind of have the ability to segregate information from Cosmic and to put those safeguards in place. Because as I mentioned, we're leveraging global processes, common platforms, and therefore the technical aspects of that differentiation may be quite challenging. So we're going through some iterations of what those solutions would look like, but I'd say those are going to be the largest and most prominent challenge that we have is how we do that differentiation for those global systems.
Chee Kin, I mean, in any other areas that have that you find potentially concerning in terms of teething issues?
No, I think Jamil said it right. I do think, I mean, we also operate in multiple jurisdictions, but I think the complexity of an institution like HSBC, Jamil's in a much better place to describe some of these anticipated things. I mean, for us, fundamentally, it breaks down into, look, your systems or your operational implementation for some reason is incompatible. I think that's the thing that we're trying to avoid. So we're redesigning all our systems and our operational processes, even as we become aware of new information from Cosmic. I guess it is a complex task for a global organization, and so I fully respect that.
I mean, when we look at the competitive advantage of bad actors, it's generally their ability to respond just quicker than the regulators or by the banks, right? So I guess one of the unintended consequences of the platform, given there are 6, participants, even though they have the majority of the market share in Singapore at the moment, is the platform is likely to push bad actors to move to smaller institutions not covered by COSMIC. I mean, Chee Kin, what considerations are being taken to potentially remediate these types of issues?
Yeah. Okay, Ken. So that's a really, really good point. A simple response would be to say that actually over time, it is only a question of time before, in a sense, the platform is tested, runs, and is proven to work, right? When that happens, you can then start scaling the platform to embrace other participants, right? So I think that would be the simple one. There's a much more subtle way of approaching this, right? Actually, with very, very large institutions, global banks and that kind of stuff, a delta of a few $100 million doesn't show up that easily. So if these actors go to a smaller institution, that delta is very obvious, and it spikes on all kinds of surveillance tools that we have. So actually, at the same time, and DBS even has to think about this, right? If a major corridor, trade corridor, Singapore and the US spikes, you can't really tell, right? But if a small corridor like Singapore, Vietnam spikes, you can tell. So that's how we can probably do things even within the system, even as we're working on bringing more participants in. We can watch where the flows are going, and then we can still figure things out. Hopefully, right? I'm signaling confidence here, but I think we're aware of that risk, and we can probably try to do some things to compensate against it. But you're right, we've got to think of the unintended consequences.
I like the signaling of confidence and the optimism. I mean, Jamil, we've talked about the role of banks within COSMIC and how you're expecting coverage to expand. Is there a role for fintechs and payment service providers within the new platform?
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting point, an interesting question. I think it's a question really that requires some reflection in terms of how the industry is evolving and moving in the payment landscape. And we have obviously seen the introduction of other payment services providers coming in and doing the role that banks used to do, which is really remitting funds for their clients. So I think when that happens and we start to see some concentrations of outflows from the banking sector into maybe some of the newer fintechs that are providing some of those additional banking services, I think in order for the platform to be really effective, it's only a matter of time before we start to engage those different participants and see whether the materiality threshold has been crossed in order for them to be brought in as participants. But like as Chee Kin mentioned, I think we've done the hard yards in terms of defining the framework, and we're going through the hard yards in terms of the technical specifications. Once we've passed that stage, the learnings and ability to scale and bring these participants in, I think we'll be able to do that again, optimistically a lot quicker than how the time taken to get to the stage that we're at the moment. And therefore, I would like to see that we'd be quite reactive to changes in terms of how the risks landscape may be sort of pivoting away from banks participating in COSMIC to those other non-bank participants, as well as non-bank participants in COSMIC, as well as the non-banking institutions involved in some of these fund remittances.
Sorry, Chee.
Yeah, no, I was just going to sort of add in there that obviously the role that law enforcement has to play here as well, because we would expect the CED to kind of provide signals to the industry and to the MAS in terms of whether we've seen some of that risk concentration shift into those non-bank participants in COSMIC or those non-bank entities that are involved in payment services.
No, it makes perfect sense. Yet again, we have a couple of minutes left, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on, COSMIC's role in terms of what does it mean for the rest of the world moving forward? Jamil?
So I think for me, that one of the key sort of outcomes from the COSMIC announcement has been the level of interest and excitement from other jurisdictions that have proactively reached out to us in Singapore to understand COSMIC in a little bit more detail, both internally within a group like HSBC and also externally as well. So I think what it's demonstrating is that the ability for the industry to come together, to work with regulators, to work with law enforcement, where there is that common political and shared intent to actually achieve this, it can happen. And therefore it is proving to be a useful template for other jurisdictions to consider and to follow. So to me, I do see the influencing factor of COSMIC in other jurisdictions as one of the key unintended benefits of having a COSMIC platform.
Chee Kin, do you see any other potential kind of regional or global benefits for COSMIC?
Yeah, maybe I'll go, if there's one thing, this was successful because we actually had everybody on the same page. And actually it's the system, it's the entire ecosystem against the criminal. We're all on the same side, right? So we all worked together in good faith to kind of like do this well. Now, this is the Singapore ecosystem's contribution to the broader global ecosystem, right? So we've learned a few things, we've shared it. I think the flip side also works, right? So there are various other projects that are going on. As they launch, as they have insights, let's share them across the system, because it is us against the criminals. I think that is something that is very important. I can see it happening from what Jamil's sharing, and long may that be the case.
And with that, unfortunately, we're out of time. As you can tell, we've only just started to scratch the surface today. And it's clear, though, that Singapore has taken a huge leap forwards with COSMIC, and there is hope that others will follow. I wanted to thank our guest, Jamil Ahmed, Chief Compliance Officer at HSBC Singapore, and Chee Kin Lam, Managing Director, Secretary, and Head of Legal Compliance at DBS Bank, also in Singapore. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.